Twice a day the ocean walks away from the shore like a lover who's had enough, retreating so far and so completely that what was underwater becomes a vast desert of exposed seabed stretching for miles, revealing shipwrecks and sea creatures stranded in tide pools and ancient stones that haven't seen sunlight in centuries. And the people who live here have learned to read the rhythm of this abandonment, have memorized the exact hours when the sea will leave and when it will return, rushing back with such violence and speed that it can outrun a person, can swallow entire beaches in minutes, can reclaim what it temporarily surrendered with the fury of something that never really left, only held its breath, only paused, only waited for the precise moment to prove that this land was always borrowed, always temporary, always subject to the ocean's inexplicable moods and the moon's invisible pull on water that obeys laws older than human understanding. You've felt this in your own life, this pattern of things leaving and returning, of presences that vanish so completely. You convince yourself they're gone forever, only to have them flood back when you've finally adjusted to their absence, when you've learned to walk on ground that used to be covered, when you've started to believe that what disappeared might stay disappeared this time. You know what it's like to watch something retreat, to see the waterline of a relationship or a feeling or a sense of security pull back and back until you're standing on exposed earth that used to be submerged, surrounded by evidence of what was there. Remnants and wreckage and the strange artifacts of a presence that defined your landscape, until it decided, without warning, without explanation, to withdraw and leave you in this in-between space, this liminal zone where neither land nor sea feels stable, where you're walking on ground that's still wet with recent departure, still holding the shape of what just left, still waiting for the inevitable return that you know is coming but can't predict with certainty. You've learned to navigate the absence, to explore what gets revealed when the water pulls away, to examine the foundations of things that were always there but hidden beneath the surface. And there's something both liberating and terrifying about seeing the bare bones of your life exposed this way, about walking on ground that's supposed to be underwater, about touching stones and shells and secrets that were meant to stay submerged. You've become someone who measures time by cycles of presence and absence, who has learned that nothing truly leaves, it only retreats temporarily before returning with force, before flooding back in and covering everything again. And you can't decide if this knowledge is comfort or curse, if understanding the pattern makes the abandonment easier, or just makes you hyper-aware that every presence is temporary. Every solid ground is just borrowed seabed, waiting for the ocean to remember it belongs to the water, not to you. You stand on beaches during low tide and feel the strangeness of it, the wrongness of being able to walk where fish were swimming hours ago, of breathing air in spaces that were recently filled with ocean, of existing in a place that's neither fully land nor fully sea, but some third thing, some transitional state that most people never see because they're not paying attention to the rhythm, not watching for the signs, not attuned to the invisible forces that move massive bodies of water away and then back, with the regularity of breath, with the inevitability of anything governed by celestial mechanics, by the gravitational conversation between moon and earth that's been happening since before humans existed, and will continue long after we're gone, and somehow we're caught in the middle of it, subject to tides we didn't create, living on shores that are constantly negotiating with forces so much larger than ourselves. Here's what's actually happening in places like the Bay of Fundy, where the sea disappears twice daily with such dramatic completeness that the difference between high and low tide can be over 50 feet, where the ocean doesn't just recede but evacuates, where fishing boats sit stranded on mud flats waiting for the water to remember them, where entire economies and ecosystems have adapted to this extreme rhythm of presence and absence. The moon's gravitational pull creates tidal bulges in Earth's oceans, and the unique funnel shape of the bay amplifies these tides, concentrating water into a narrowing channel that forces it higher during high tide and drains it more completely during low tide, creating this daily spectacle of disappearance and return that looks like magic but is actually celestial mechanics, except that knowing the science doesn't make it less mysterious, doesn't make it less powerful, doesn't explain why standing on exposed seabed feels like trespassing in a space that was never meant for human feet. Why watching the water return feels both terrifying and inevitable. Why this rhythm of loss and return has become a metaphor for everything in your life that leaves and comes back in patterns you can predict but never fully control. And here's the truth that cuts deeper than any scientific explanation can reach. The sea doesn't really disappear, it's never truly gone, it's just temporarily elsewhere, gathered in different places, waiting for the right moment to return. And everything in your life that feels like permanent absence is probably just in its low tide phase, pulled away by forces you can't see, governed by rhythms you don't control, existing somewhere else temporarily but not erased, not destroyed, not finished with you even though it feels finished. And the question isn't whether things will return, but whether you'll be ready when they do. Whether you've learned to read the signs, to recognize the moment when the tide turns, To understand that the ground you're standing on was never meant to stay dry. That the absence you've adjusted to was always just an intermission. That everything that matters enough to hurt when it leaves matters enough to come back eventually in its own time, following patterns older than your pain, more reliable than your fear, more inevitable than your doubt. The locals who live with these dramatic tides have learned something that took generations to understand. You don't fight the rhythm, you learn it, you memorize it, you organize your life around it, you harvest what the low tide reveals, and you prepare for what the high tide will bring. And you never ever forget that the ground you're walking on belongs to the ocean and is only yours on loan, only solid temporarily, only safe for a window of time that you can calculate but never extend. Never pause. Never stop from closing when the moon decides it's time for the water to remember where it belongs. They've learned to build houses on stilts, to time their boat trips with precision, to gather food from tide pools during the brief hours when the sea forgets them, and they've made peace with the fundamental instability of living on a border between elements, of calling home a place that transforms completely twice a day, of loving land that refuses to stay land, of building lives on shores that are constantly being renegotiated by forces so much larger than human desire. So when you're standing in your own low tide, when something you needed has withdrawn so completely you can't imagine it ever coming back, when you're walking on the exposed foundations of your life, examining what was always there but hidden, when you're in that strange in-between space where everything feels temporary and nothing feels solid, remember the Bay of Fundy. Remember that the most dramatic disappearances often precede the most dramatic returns. That absence is just presence holding its breath. That the water hasn't forgotten the land even when it's miles away, gathering strength for the return. And the return is always coming, always inevitable, always governed by laws more reliable than human emotion, more predictable than human behavior, more certain than any promise anyone could make you, because it's not based on choice or feeling or whether you deserve it. It's based on gravity and momentum and the eternal conversation between Earth and Moon that doesn't care about your readiness, doesn't wait for your permission, doesn't ask if you've healed enough to handle the flood when it comes. Start understanding that you're living on tidal shores whether you realize it or not, that everything in your life that matters is subject to these rhythms of presence and absence, arrival and departure, exposure and submersion, and fighting this reality is like fighting the ocean, is like demanding that the tides stay high forever, that nothing ever leave, that security be permanent and presence be guaranteed. When really the beauty and the terror of being alive is exactly this: that nothing stays, that everything moves, that the sea will always leave and will always return. And learning to live well means learning to harvest what the low tide reveals, to prepare for what the high tide will bring, to find stability not in things staying the same but in trusting the rhythm, in believing that what's gone will come back in its season, that what's absent hasn't abandoned you, but is just following patterns older and more reliable than your fear. The place where the sea disappears isn't really about geography. It's about every life that's learned to breathe in the space between loss and return, to walk on ground that's still wet with recent absence, to live with the knowledge that nothing is permanent but everything is cyclical, that the worst abandonments often precede the most powerful returns, that standing on exposed seabed isn't trespassing, it's witnessing, it's seeing what was always there beneath the surface. It's learning to read your own foundations when the water that normally covers them decides to briefly, temporarily, inevitably pull away and show you what you're built on, what you're standing on, what will still be there when the tide returns and everything floods again, and you realize that you survived the absence, that you learned from the exposure, that you're still standing when the water comes back, because you finally understand that this is the pattern, this is the rhythm, this is what it means to live on shores that belong to forces larger than yourself. To love things that move in tides. To build a life on beaches that are constantly negotiating with the ocean about where the water stops and where the land begins. And the negotiation never ends. The tide never stops turning. The sea never stops disappearing and returning. And neither do the things that matter most in your life. The people and feelings and certainties that leave and come back. Leave and come back. Following the moon's instructions. Obeying gravity's pull. Teaching you that nothing is ever truly gone. It's just waiting for high tide, just gathering elsewhere, just preparing for the inevitable return that's written in the stars, carved in the calendar, promised by the same celestial mechanics that have moved oceans since before you were born and will keep moving them long after you're gone, and somehow impossibly beautifully devastatingly. That's exactly the kind of reliability you've been searching for all along.